You know, and it has something to do with mystical experience, because there's a bodhisattva. It kind of looks like he has a hat, but that's not a hat. That's a whole bunch of bodhisattvas going back to eternity, right? And this hole in the sky here is like a hole into time, and these things are recurring across time. It's the eternal recurrence of this redemptive archetype, and the sky opens up, and you can see that thing recurring and recurring and recurring. Same idea is basically, that's the blue Buddha, who's a healing entity, sitting in a mandala, which is like a representation of paradise. And it's the same idea. It's like reality opens up and reveals this image of perfection. And so it's a universal conception. And I think it's a representation of the possibility of the metaphysical and the physical coming together in some sort of communication. It's something like that anyways. And I mean, you have to remember that there's absolutely no doubt that people have metaphysical and religious experiences. That's an absolute fact. You can induce them chemically. You can induce them electrochemically. Lots of people who have epilepsy have epileptic prodromas that are associated with divine enlightenment. So Dostoevsky, for example, he had epilepsy, and that was really, I think, one of the things that made him a great author. And Dostoevsky would have this feeling that he was going to have an epileptic seizure, and he said that the feeling for him was that the world was opening up and he was becoming more and more and more enlightened, and he was just on the verge of grasping the essence of existence, and then he'd have an epileptic seizure. And for the subjective feeling was that much knowledge was just too much for him to bear. Well, you know, you can say, well, that was a neurological abnormality, and fine, you know, but God, he was Dostoevsky, you know, and so you can't just brush that off. So, yeah, well, so that's the Trinitarian idea fundamentally, and this notion here is the notion that, well, the cross is a funny thing, because the cross marks the center, you know, and it's an X, and the X is the center of the world, like the X that a cathedral is, and it's the center of the world is where you are, because as a consciousness you're the center of the world, and that center of the world is a place of betrayal and suffering and limitation. That's exactly what it is. And the question is, well, given that, and given the fact that you know it, what the hell are you supposed to do about it? And what that representation, I believe that's Goya, what that representation implies is that you're supposed to voluntarily accept that and then move forward. Well, in good faith and with courage, that's the notion, and that you're supported. You're supported by your tradition, and that's why you need your tradition too. That's why you need to be embedded in your tradition, because without that, without the support, let's say, of your father, and I mean that both practically and metaphysically, without that behind you, without the knowledge of you as both a biological and a cultural creature, without that depth of knowledge, you don't have the courage to do it, because you don't know what you are, what you could be. And so without that, because you're a historical creature, you know what, students ask me sometimes, why study history? It's like, well, because history is about you, that's why. It's like, history tells you who you are. You can't tell who you are because you only live a little while. How the hell can you figure out who you are? So you need all this collected wisdom and all this dream-like information and all this mythology and all this narrative to inform you about what you are beyond what you see of yourself. And you know, you're pummeled down and people picked on you and there's 50 things about you that are horrible, and you know, you've got a self-esteem problem and you're sort of hunched over and you've got all these problems, you know, and so it's not easy to see, let's say, the divinity that lurks behind that, unless you're aware of the heroic stories of the past and the metaphysics of consciousness, let's say. I don't think that you can have the courage to regard yourself as the sort of creature that can stand up underneath that intense existential burden and move forward in courage and grace. And of course, that's part of the reason that I'm talking about these biblical stories, and it's 9:30, so we're going to have to stop. Okay, so we're going to stop exactly at 10 tonight, because that's the deal with the theater people. And besides, I'll be out of anything intelligent to say by that point, certainly. So, well, at least we got through one story, so that was good. So, yeah. Okay. Let's give everyone like just a few seconds to settle down, and everyone who wants to leave can leave. So thank you for all for coming, by the way. I'm constantly amazed that everybody comes and listens to this, because it's just, well, it's strange. Let's put it that way. So far it's been fun though, so that's good. So okay, let's go.
Hi, that works. Hi, Dr. Peterson. I was raised Catholic, and anytime there was a bit of an inherent contradiction, let's call it, in the documents of the Bible, it would be referred to as a mystery. And there's one mystery I've always kind of wondered about, and it's very important to Genesis. How do you deal with a perfect God, or the conception of a perfect God, who by nature is incapable of an imperfect design, or incapable of a perfect design? So what I mean by that is many religions present, for example, good and evil as separate deities that pre-existed simultaneously. What's interesting about Christianity is that Lucifer, the embodiment of evil in the Christian religion, is an outgrowth of God, and is sometimes, Milton, for example, presents him as a rebel against his interpretation of God's tyranny, right? Another example, we didn't touch on Eden today, but in paradise, a supposedly perfect garden, a perfect design, is infiltrated again by that evil outgrowth of a so-called perfect God. So from a psychological perspective, do you think there's a significance to this presentation of perfection, yet the contradictory flaws that are sort of naturally part of that perfection, quote unquote?
Oh, so good. That's a good, simple question.
We're starting good.
See, Carl Jung, he was kind of Manichaean in his approach, and he tended towards thinking that evil, in some sense, was a separate entity. And I thought about that for a long time, because there's a potency about evil that just can't be brushed away. And I mean this most practically, as I've said, like for people in my clinical practice, I've dealt with many people who are touched by malevolence, and there's no other way of stating it properly. And this happens a lot to people who have post-traumatic stress disorder. Like, they encountered someone that wanted to hurt them for the sake of hurting them. It wasn't some misunderstanding. You can forget about that. It wasn't that at all. And so to deny the reality of evil, in some sense, I think is the ultimate in naivety, even though it's a word that you won't hear used, for example, very often in universities anymore. But I just can't understand that at all. But I thought about that a lot, and so I'm going to kind of answer that question by hitting it scattershot. The first thing is that there's an idea, and this happens in Milton, that comes across in Milton, that distance from God is hell. Right? That hell doesn't actually have any, no, it's ambivalent in Milton, but the fundamental claim seems to be that the farther you get from God, the more it's hell. And then there's another idea that Milton's Satan, who's Lucifer, the bringer of light, right? He's God's highest angel, gone most wrong. And I kind of think about him as the spirit of rationality, of intelligence. It's not because I'm not an admirer of intelligence, because hooray for intelligence, but one of the things that Milton seemed to cotton on to before the rise of modern totalitarian states was that intellect has the capacity to fall in love with its own creations and to elevate them to the highest place, which is basically a totalitarian claim. It's like, what I know is everything that needs to be known, and if it was only manifest in the world would become a utopia. And I also think that's, and we'll talk about this next week, I also think that that's the core idea behind the Tower of Babel. Remember, the Tower of Babel is raised by human beings so that the pinnacle will hit heaven. And so it's the idea that we can build a structure that makes the transcendent unnecessary. And so, okay, so there's those two things. Then there's an idea of free will that's associated with it too. And it seems to me that in order for there to be good, there has to be evil. And so I think the answer is something like this, is that in order for there to be being, there has to be limitation. In order for there to be good, there has to be the possibility of evil. I think the right path is to exist such that the possibility of evil remains open, but that you choose the good. And I don't think that evil per se is built into the structure of the world. I do think that that's human. I think that evil is human. And I think it's understandable. I did a lecture that's online about the distinction between evil and tragedy. And tragedy seems to be built into the structure of the world, and perhaps you can blame God for that. I mean, it doesn't seem to me that it's your fault that there are earthquakes, for example. But it is not obvious to me either that it's tragedy that takes the spirit out of people. I think that human beings are actually equipped to deal with tragedy, but we're not equipped to deal with malevolence. That destroys people. And so I think that metaphysically speaking, the world is structured so that people have a choice between good and evil. And so then the next question is why do we have a choice? And that's where my knowledge runs out. Like the alchemists, for example, speculated that, and the Orthodox Christians also follow this line of reasoning, is that human beings in some sense are furthering creation by our actions and by our choices. And I think there's something to that. It's like creation is unfinished in some sense, and that we're participating in moving it in whatever direction it is that we want to move it. And part of that is that we have free will, and part of that is that we have the choice between good and evil. And that's also all associated with the significance, maybe the cosmic significance of our lives. And that strikes me as plausible. And I think the weight of responsibility that people feel existentially is an indication of that. So that's about the best I could do with that. So.
And it seems the way you're describing it, it's built into at least the text that you presented, because one of the other things I'd noticed was God consistently describes creation as good, right? He creates light.